Mean Girls just got a Broadway show that opened recently, and it's getting compared to Heather's a lot, especially because they're very similar movies, and Heather's got an off-Broadway show a couple years ago, which is awesome, by the way. If you haven't listened to the soundtrack, give it a shot. It's great. Anyways, an interesting connection between the two is that the director of Mean Girls is the brother of the screenwriter for Heather's, and they are very similar story-wise, but they're also very different. So I'm just doing a very informal comparison between the two of them. It's hard to say that one is objectively better than the other because they're both very good in very different ways. They're both very funny. They're both about high school, but they have a lot of differences. Heather's is much darker of the two, and I think you can't really say one's better than the other. I think there's really just one you prefer more, which can change. At this point in time, I prefer Heather's. I think it's a modern Shakespearean story. I think it's darker, and it's much closer to how I think than Mean Girls. They look at the same subject with a very different lens. Mean Girls looks at relationships, and especially relationships with girls, in a much more sociological, anthropological study, studying the human being as an animal, versus Heather's, which looks at the same thing, but in terms of power dynamics, which you can see with the red scrunchie, how they relate to each other, and with their colors. Personally, which is a lot closer to how I think and how I view things. So overall, I do prefer Heather's, partially for that reason. Looking at the actual characters and performances, interestingly enough, let's start with the Mean Girl themselves, Heather Chandler versus Regina. Now, interestingly enough, I think between the two of them, I actually think Regina is the meaner one. Part of that is she has more screen time, but she gets more time to be more manipulative. You see her, there's an anger in that performance. A big part of it is the performance and the screen time. There is something ironically very funny about Kim Walker's performance as Heather Chandler. When she's yelling at Veronica, I don't get a venom behind it, versus with Regina George, there is an anger behind everything she says, and that makes her much more intimidating. I think, but honestly, I look at Heather Chandler and laugh. She's so funny. I don't know how much of this was unintentional, but it's, especially because of how dark the movie is, it's so funny to see how seriously she takes popularity. And it's like Cruel Intentions, or because it's Shakespeare, it's Macbeth set in high school. That's what Heather's is. So I can laugh at some of the teenage angst because it gets some of the accurate stuff that Mean Girls I don't think touches on. There's a really funny line with JD at the end where he rattles off his philosophy as he's breaking down, and he says, "Isn't that deep?" I thought, that, oh my god, that nails it on the head. There's an obsession we have as teens with being deep. I found that very, very funny. Anyways, more informal comparisons. Most of the characters align up pretty well. With Gretchen Wieners being, interestingly enough, having that comparison to Heather Duke, Karen with McNamara. They're similar, but they're also very different, and it's so hard to pick between the two of them because they both do their job very, very well. And I think it is interesting to see because I feel like, especially with Gretchen versus Heather Duke, they're a similar character, but they're also very different as people, very different philosophies, because Gretchen will align herself with whoever is the most confident because of her own insecurities, whereas Heather Duke will take power the second the opportunity arises. So that's, whereas Gretchen I don't think would ever do that. That's fascinating. I think for that reason, I think Heather Duke is a bit more interesting. Just so because you can see the character development really shine through. You can see where she starts from. You could sympathize with her for taking all that abuse. I honestly think Heather Duke gets much more abuse. With Gretchen, it's all about petty stuff. And part of that is the age. You do make things bigger than they really are, but they could still last with you. Heather Duke does take much more abuse, as she does have an eating disorder, which you see on screen. And they don't take it seriously. Heather Chandler does verbally abuse her. So you can kind of understand her feeling powerless and her thinking she can take that power and her philosophy on what that means. With Karen versus McNamara, I think that's interesting. They're so different but so similar because they're both clueless, but something so funny about Karen gets a lot of the one-liners, and I also think it's very sweet how McNamara and Veronica become friends. As for the leads themselves, I do prefer Veronica over Katie. I mean, they're both good. They're both good characters. It's a matter of preference. But Veronica has this anger and angst that I love, versus Katie, who starts naive and then gets caught up in it. With Heather's, you see it. You don't see the fallout. You don't see Veronica selling herself out. You do in the musical, but I'm only looking at the movies. You see her when she's already in the in crowd and hating it. And you see there is an anger with her, and you know that Veronica has power. It's indicated quite often in the movie that Veronica has just as much power as Heather Chandler. There's even indications that Heather Chandler resents Veronica because she can't control her. Similar in Mean Girls, but still, there's something that's stronger about Veronica as a character. More venom, more anger, more punch. And I like that. I like that character because it also takes this story one step further, because there is a fantasy about wanting to do harm unto people who hurt you that a lot of people have. But going through with it is completely different, and there is an emotional cost to that, which you see 100%. And I think that is so fascinating. I'm really glad that both movies have their cult statuses. I don't think JD really has a counterpart in Mean Girls. I think the closest would be Aaron Samuels, who Aaron seems like a sweet guy. He just seems like a nice guy you want to hang out with, so good love interest. JD, of course. Bad. Oh god, that is... God, how do you describe JD? Kind of like the Joker. I think I showed this to one of my dates, and he said, I like this movie a lot more than I expected to, and he compared JD to the Joker. You get a philosophy with this character. You see how he thinks. And it's fascinating to see. I think it is... You really can get so many different points of view with the same subject matter, and I really like that about both. I'm really glad we have both of these movies. I'm glad that people love them as much as they do. Yeah. I want to rewatch both again side by side and do a much more formal review on this.